From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
As the new deadline to fund the federal government nears, congressional leaders agree on a top-level spending figure. But can Speaker Mike Johnson deliver amid grumbling from the right flank? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. One big question for Washington in the early days and months of 2024 is the perennial about funding the federal government, which is currently on a short-term spending bill. This time, the overarching story, though, is whether the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, will prove more capable of wrangling his fractious Republican colleagues than some of his predecessors. Let's start with a clip of Speaker Johnson on Face the Nation this weekend before this spending deal was announced, talking about the issue overall.
We have insisted that federal spending must be addressed in a very serious and sober manner. We crossed an important threshold this week, $34 trillion in federal debt. There's never been anything of that magnitude in the history of the country, and it's not sustainable. The Congress has a responsibility. We have the power of the purse, of course, and we have to be good stewards of precious taxpayer resources. We cannot continue to borrow money to spend it. And so reducing non-defense discretionary spending must be a priority of Congress, and we're trying to insist upon that in these negotiations.
Kim, the Speaker has now made a top-level spending figure with Democrats in the Senate, and as typical with any kind of deal, both sides are saying that it is a good deal. Here's a quote from the Senate leader Chuck Schumer. By securing the $772.7 billion for non-defense discretionary funding, we can protect key domestic priorities like veterans benefits, health care, and nutrition assistance from the draconian cuts sought by right-wing extremists, unquote. So, Kim, I guess the first question is, what is in this deal, and is it a good deal in your mind for the Republicans in the House?
To understand this deal, you first have to back up to last May, which was when former Speaker Kevin McCarthy negotiated a debt ceiling agreement with the White House, which in theory set top caps on how much spending there would be in fiscal 2024. I would note that at that time, Republicans got some other wins as part of that deal. They clawed back about $28 billion in COVID funds. They ended the pause on student loan repayments, clawed back about $10 billion worth of IRS funding, got a few very modest work requirements and even some permitting reform. And they did all of this in return for passing a debt ceiling increase that needed to be passed anyway. And they did it by being united. Afterward, there was some grumbling that the numbers, the caps in this were not high enough. So what we have here is Johnson actually now putting this into the reality of the budget process. We needed top line figures in order for appropriators to parcel out the money that goes to each of the 12 spending bills. So what we have here is a top line that largely hews to that May agreement. $1.59 trillion, at least on paper. And there are certainly, I think, some real benefits in this. We've got domestic non-defense discretionary on paper at $704 billion. Defense growing 3% at $880 to $886 billion. This is important just because Democrats have long demanded parity between those two numbers. In this case, domestic discretionary spending is largely remaining flat, whereas defense is growing a bit. The complaints here come in a side deal that Kevin McCarthy made with the White House all the way back in May to have an additional $69 billion of domestic discretionary spending. Johnson's argument is that, look, that deal was already made. I couldn't do anything about it. But what I have done is in negotiating this new figure that we're going to go forward with, I have reduced that number in a certain regards by getting some pay-fors, as it were, or offsets, as it were, for that money. So some of that $69 billion is now going to be paid for with an additional $10 billion that had been earmarked for the IRS. Now it's not going to go to the IRS anymore. That brings to $20 billion for fiscal 2024 that the IRS has had its budget cut, and another $6 billion of additional COVID funds. He also argues that the Senate had been on track to add even more money to that $69 billion, about $14 billion. So in total, he has saved taxpayers about $30 billion more of what they were going to have to pay. I think that if you're just going off the level of what had been negotiated, This is as about good as Republicans are going to get. They are facing a shutdown. Everyone would like to see it be more, but the spending blowouts of the COVID years were enormous. It's going to take some while to chip that back down and a lot of discipline. So I think, given to a couple of other aspects of this, they fixed a few accounting gimmicks that have been in it. I would argue that overall, this is a modest win for Republicans that's going to give them some real political benefits too if they get it done. We'll see if the right flank agrees with that.
Let's give a word to one of those critics. Here is Texas Congressman Chip Roy on CNN explaining his opposition to this top-line spending figure.
There's not going to be support, across the board among Republicans because a lot of us want to reduce spending. And the American people sent us here to cut spending and not keep doing more of the same thing. We're $34 trillion in debt. Both sides should agree to cut spending. And in fact, we did. We came to an agreement last year to cap spending. Now we're going to blow past those caps.
Kate, there's also a tweet by the House Freedom Caucus that I would point to. Here it is. It's even worse than we thought. Don't believe the spin. Once you break through typical Washington math, the true total programmatic spending level is $1.658 trillion, not $1.59 trillion. And for listeners doing the math between those numbers, this is the 68 billion, 69 billion, not quite 70 that Kim was referring to earlier. But if you do the math on that, that is an increase of about 4% roughly. And the Journal's editorial on this deal says that despite Chuck Schumer's crowing that it protects those domestic programs, the domestic funding level is basically flat, while defense is up about 3%. So, Kate, I guess I don't understand the argument. Maybe it is a modest victory as Kim describes it. But remember, we have Republicans who are only in control of one house of Congress, not the Senate and not the White House.
Right. And think about how the House GOP position in general has sort of deteriorated since this agreement was made. I mean, they threw out Kevin McCarthy. They spent weeks without a speaker. They finally elected Mike Johnson. Their majority has thinned. I believe Kevin McCarthy was operating with a 4-vote majority, and that is on its way to 2. So half the margin that McCarthy had. You had the Senate, to Mike Johnson's point, trying to add 14 bill above the deal's levels into their own appropriations bills. And so I'm not clear exactly how the House would be in a position to leverage enormous new spending cuts over what they'd agreed to, given the hand that they're playing. You do never hear that detail explained. Kim, I think, gave a great survey of where those differentials come from and what amounts to the difference in that $69 billion. And I'd add one more thing that the deal does. Okay, and it's kind of arcane, but what Democrats often do is they try to bake spending into the baseline. So they add it once and then they put it in what's called the baseline for the budget, so that way, if you try to just go back to what you were doing the year before, it's considered a cut because it's baked into the baseline of the budget. This isn't a way that the Budget Act of 1974 really rules our process. But I make that point because Johnson, one thing that he accomplished here was keeping some of the money that Democrats wanted to bake into the funding projections out of that baseline. And he puts that figure at $200 billion over 10 years. By just not baking that money into the baseline. So this is just one example of the kind of unglamorous, small things that I think this deal includes that are consequential and used to be the sort of things that Republicans would really focus on and try to do a lot of. So again, I'm not clear on exactly how House Republicans were going to leverage their hand into running the table over a Democratic Senate and the White House. And I also think, of course, there are things not to like in this deal. The thing that I don't like about this deal is that while I agree with Kim that there is a large benefit to breaking parity between defense spending and discretionary domestic spending and not forcing those to go dollar for dollar, it's still a real cut to defense after inflation, and the cap for 2025, it'll be an even deeper cut after inflation. But again, most of the people who share that view in Congress, who are very concerned about the 2 regional wars going on around the world, about what China is doing in the South China Sea, are not fighting this bill because they understand that there are limitations of what's possible and that you have to concede that reality. So I do find it ironic that we have this one flank that thinks that their particular objections, and I share them, the concern that we're spending too much money, though that is largely an entitlement problem, which is 2/3 of our federal budget, that their concerns just rule the day, even though they control this one branch of one part of Congress.